Dear friends, students, and colleagues, today it is a special day for us at Asha Ganga Jamni Heritage Joint Shared Past Series. For today, we are here to present before you our 50th lecture, and that too without a single gap. When we started this series more than half a year back, we were not sure whether we will be able to pull through two lectures per week schedule with prominent names from the world over. Some also made fun of us of our endeavor. Some said, as they have nothing else to do, they want to mark their presence on the social media. That we did. Our presence was actually marked. Our mission too has met with some success. And all this would not have been possible without all of you out there. You all have been our constant support. We still have some more weeks to go before we culminate this series. Hope you people will keep listening in and putting up your questions. Today, we have once again with us a big banner name from Aligarh School of History. I mean Professor Shirin Muswi. Professor Muswi has already delivered two lectures in the past months and stands in no need of an introduction. Anybody who has some interest in Indian history has heard about her and her work. She is an inspiration to many of us. She is an example that you can rise high in your field of interest, even if you come from a different background or a different field. She was a student of science. She started as a statistician and ended up breaking the glass ceiling of the field of history. As Abul Fazl was to Mughal Empire, she is to Aligarh School of History. And her knowledge is not confined only to economic history of the 17th century. Her repertoire of writings contain much path-breaking researches in econometric history, intellectual history, social history, urban history, gender, and women's history. Her research papers span from ancient to Sultanate to Mughal to colonial and even contemporary periods. If Professor Irfan Habib is the brain behind Aligarh Historian Society, a society which carries forward the legacy of secular and scientific history writing, which was once the hallmark of Aligarh School, she is the heart of AHS. It cannot exist without her constant hard work and organizational skills. Her dedication to academic interests and AHS has been such that she turned down requests and opportunities offered to her to become a vice chancellor of a university and the chairman of a very prestigious funding agency associated with the Government of India. Personally, she had been my great anchor. Many a storm I have overcome due to her support. And of course, I have been a recipient of some of her choicest scoldings and criticism. She has been both my teacher, guardian, and an elder sister. Today, she is going to speak to us on a topic on which she had written many years back, but a theme which is still as relevant today as it was when she had written on it. Mughal encounters with Vedanta. In a way, the theme is actually more important today than it was in the yesteryears. Over to you, Professor Muswi.
Thank you very much, Professor Nadeem Rizvi, and of course, for your exaggerated description of mine. Of course, one has always to make a big allowance to exaggerations in such matters. In any way, I would like to begin immediately with the theme. And before doing that, I would simply would like to uh, say sorry that I may or may not be very up to mark today because I'm not really feeling well today. Right. It was in Akbar's time that an unprecedented effort was made to render Sanskrit text into Persian. The major text translated was Mahabharata as Razumnama, which greatly impressed Akbar. The other text included the Atharveda, the Ramayana, the Harivansha, and the Yog Vashisht. This gave Akbar, Abul Fazl, and their circle an extensive idea of the realm of philosophical speculations in Hindu thought, along with much information on law, mythology, and ritual. With part of this information must have also been orally transmitted. All this is reflected in the account that Abul Fazl gives of Hindu concepts and belief in his Ain-e Akbari that received acclaim from none less than, for its accuracy, from none less than Sir Jadunath Sarkar. While Akbar himself was critical of the theory of divine incarnation, he was obviously greatly intrigued by the fact that the concept of divine judgment leading souls to heaven or hell was not present or at any rate not important in Hindu thought. When he thought that the concept of the judgment day was being brought into the Mahabharata by its translator, he angrily censured him, of which uh, the author, the translator, Abdul Qadir Badayuni, has left a memorable account. It has been emphasized, however, that Akbar's religious ideas were primarily drawn from the Islamic tradition. This is certainly true if one keeps in mind the influence on his thought of Ibn Arabi's theory of pantheism, or shall one say quasi pantheism, and the Ishraqi philosophy of illumination. There is no evidence that while formulating the famous paragraph in which Abul Fazl gives a description of the creation and of the illusoriness of differences, he had any other source for these ideas in his mind than Ibn Arabi. This brings us to the question of how far Akbar and his circle were aware, if at all, of Shankaracharya. When one looks at Abul Fazl's account of Hindu religious beliefs, one finds a long chapter on Vedant, as it was generally written in Persian, Vedant, containing two passages which are undoubtedly attests a recognition of Vedanta as a pantheistic doctrine. Let me relate these to you. The professors of this important school of thought hold views on Padarth, Parman, etc., in the manner of Mimamsa, and most argue on the lines of Bhatt, but they regard heaven, hell, meritorious deeds, and chastisement and other descriptive phenomena of this transient, transient, transient world as non existence that appears as existence. In some texts, they speak of two padarths, Drik, Atma or soul. Secondly, Drisi or Drishya, Genesis. Except for the infinite God, they do not consider anything existing and hold the universe to be an appearance without existence. Just as a human being, while dreaming in sleep, sees figures and undergoes thousands of pleasures and joys, so they hold what we experience while awake to be similar. One spreading light has just assumed different names with different kinds of perception. He goes on to add, in this great science, they speak of six things: Brahman, Ishwar, Jeev, Agyan, Sambandh, Bhed. They regard all the six as without beginning and the first one as without end. Brahma is incomparable creator. Agyan, as against previous thinkers, they regard it as existing, Vujudi, and hold it to consist of two powers. Vachep, Vikshep, Shakti, the power of becoming apparent, and Avarna Shakti, the power of concealing recognition. They say Agyan combined with the first power gets the name Maya. Combined with the second, the Avarna, literally becomes Avidya or Avidya. When the sacred self gets linked to Maya, they call it Ishwar, and no deficiency occurs in real consciousness. And when that infinite self unites with Avidya, they call it Jeev, as also Jivatma. The veiled knowledge becomes concealed, and the dust of defeat does not settle on the skirt of the Almighty. This terminology does not indicate any close knowledge of Shankaracharya's reconstruction of Vedantic philosophy. The pre Shankaracharya Vedantism was largely monotheistic and devotional, with an increasing induction of monism. The term avidya and maya go back to the Upanishads, the former indicating spiritual ignorance, the latter the special or magical divine power to create. It appears that maya is being used here in the sense earlier in the earlier sense than in that of illusion, so strongly implanted in the vocabulary of Shankaracharya's Vedanta, where it becomes is indistinguishable from avidya. We must remember that Akbar's cycle was already familiar with Yog Vashisht, which is regarded as one of the sources of Shankaracharya's Vedanta. However, be it may, the passages quoted from Abul Fazl makes it clear that he was familiar with the view of Vedanta that set it at one level at least as a pantheistic system with all reality treated as one and the differences dismissed as illusory. It might have occurred to him as well as to others that here the perception of the universe was fairly close to that of Ibn Arabi, whose belief had already by the mid 16th century established dominance over Sufistic philosophy in India, despite some vehement opposition. But no such explicit statement is made, and Abul Fazl ends his brief statement without comment, let alone approval. This is a different situation from that of the position given to Shankaracharya and the Vedanta in the next important Persian account of Hinduism, the celebrated Dabistani Mazahib, written around 1653. What is likely is that the encounter with Vedanta in its pantheistic form came late in Akbar's life, well after his own religious beliefs, drawing succor from Ibn Arabi, had become well set. The role that Jadru played in this initial encounter may therefore be of some interest. This name appears at the end of the list of the second category of religious personages, those who are masters of the spirit, Khudawand-e Batin, in the Ain-e-Akbari. He had thus become known at Akbar's court, but when? His name at the end of the list may suggest that he had come to be noticed quite late, and so was the last to be included. This would mean that he became known to Akbar's circle just before the Ain was closed finally, a little before Abul Fazl's death in 1602. Jahangir notes that Akbar had met Jadrup at Ujjain when he was returning to Agra after annexing Khandesh, that is in the spring of 1601. It might be that Abul Fazl entered Jadrup's name in the list around this time. If so, Jadrup could not have had anything to do with the form in which Vedantic thought had been earlier introduced at Akbar's court, an introduction reflected in Abul Fazl's main text. But then, the Vedanta earlier known at Akbar's court was still in its pre Shankaracharya form, as we have seen. What he did to judge from the great impression he made on Jahangir and his court was at a secondary stage when he moved the Vedanta for the first time into a central position as the Hindu counterpart of Muslim mysticism or Tasawwuf. Jahangir, describing his first meeting with Jadrup, stated that he had excellently mastered the science of Vedanta, which is the science of Tasawwuf. The statement is of singular significance, since this means that in Jahangir's eyes, Tasawwuf was basically pantheistic, which also was what, what Vedanta was, especially in Shankaracharya's version of it. Jahangir's secretary and historian Motamid Khan repeats this statement with a significance addition while he writes, the science of Vedant, which today or Imroz is taken to mean Tasawwuf. Does he then mean that there was a recently changed view of Muslim mysticism, defining it as pantheism, or that there was a new view now of Vedanta as similarly pantheistic that led to this identification? While the former would be a possible proposition, it is likely that Mu'tamid Khan meant the latter. For after a few verses written by him on Jadrup, he goes on to tell us that Jadrup had expounded the concept of Muslim mysticism, Tasawwuf-e-Ahle Islam, adapting them to the system of his own mysticism, Tasawwuf-e-Khud. In other words, the Vedanta that Jadrup expounded seemed to his Muslim hearers very similar to what they had heard from Ibn Arabi. The description given by Jahangir of Jadrup is very well known. A crucial break, he gives that in his memoirs, which are also being translated into English, so accessible to all. A crucial breakthrough occurred when the late Professor Athar Ali suggested an identification of Jahangir's Jadrup with Chitrarup or Chitrarupa, which implies a Sanskrit form of the name Chitrarupa. In the Dabistan-e Mazahib. Since Jadrup in Persian writing can be equally legitimately be read Chidrup and T is often corrupted to D in compound consonants in popular Indian speech. The identification is very plausible. It becomes definitive when we actually read in the Bistan's account how much Jahangir honored him. The description of his person as an ascetic also enmeshes with Jahangir's own account of him. The Dabistan's biography of him then becomes and so important that it is worth uh, quoting. The sannyasis are essentially divided into two groups: the Dhanhari, who do not let the hair grow long and conform to the dictates of the Smriti, that is the law. The second, Udhut, who are like the Dandharas in burning the sacred thread and drinking water mixed with its ashes. But unlike the Dandharas, they let the hair grow so that it turns into ropes, which they call jatas. They do not have a daily bath and smear ash on their head and body, which they call vibhut. The chief of the second group is Shankararaja or Shankaracharya. The Hindus believe that since their scholars did not understand the science of Vedant or Vedanta, Mahadev, that is Shiva, took the avatar of Shankararaj to expound the Vedant, and here are numerous books on it by him. Gosai Chitrupa belongs to the group of Dhandharis. He comes from the Brahmins of Gujarat, of a sept that is called Nagar Brahmins. His father was a jeweler of those parts, of high status and wealthy. Chitrarupa, having gained elevation in God worship, abandoned wife, mother, father, and children, and took to the ways of the sannyasis. He applied himself to the holding of breath and ultimately obtained great repute. But he did not abandon asceticism. He did not eat more than three karas, that is, chamchas or spoons. The kara is meant a spoon. They say at least he ate nothing but salt, satisfying himself with three karas of salt. Among the sannyasis, so many tales of miracles of his are current as cannot be recorded in this book. They say that from perseverance in the set path of austerities and from his hearing God's voice, a sound like that of a guitar used to come out of his veins. From an Iranian mystic, it has been heard, or that is, the Iranian mystic has said that in that year, in the year 1635, one night Chitrupa came to me and said, "Get up so that we may go on a trip." Of necessity, I went with him. We reached a deep lake. Chitrupa put his foot on the water and crossed over in such a manner that the water did not reach the upper part of his foot. Thereafter, he called me to him. I went along the bank of the lake and joined him. While waiting for me, Chitrupa sat on a stone seat near the lake. When I sat near him, he pointed to that seat and asked, "Do you have any idea whose work this is?" Having observed the large size of the stones, which could not have been less than 10 gaz or yards in length, I was struck with wonder and said, "This is the work of giants." Chitrupa said, "This is not so. A friend of mine was living here. He was determined upon building this seat and bringing down large stones on his shoulders from the hilltop, set them here. People wondering at the large size sat in hiding at night. They saw the sannyasi bringing such a heavy stone upon his shoulders. Inadvertently, they asked, "What is the reason for taking such a trouble? Please tell us to bring the stones from the hilltop and prepare the seat, provided the stones are not to be so large." The sannyasi became angry and left this village. He then told me, "Get up so that we can go and see him." Perforce, I went to see him. He was sitting cross legged, immersed in himself. Chitrupa told him, "This Darvesh is a guest of ours. Call your instrumentalist." He replied, "You should bring on the light." Chitrupa turned to the forest, and a large lamp coming from nowhere got lighted, and from one end to the other, the expanse of the forest was illuminated. The sound of many instruments reached the ears. At the first sign of dawn, we parted from him and returned home by the way mentioned in the same manner. He then quote a verse: "If the chief of magicians becomes our guide, what's the difference? There is no heart in which God's work doesn't go on." In the high crowned cap of the zealot and the ring of the Sufi, there is only the corner of your eyebrow, not the arch of the prayer hall. Hakim Kamran Shirazi says that he was with Chitrupa at Banaras when one of the Muslim grandees, an noble or an amir, came to see him and asked him, "What do you say in respect of our prophet?" He replied, "You yourself say he was sent by God. He is the guide of the people to whom the true king had sent him. He need not trouble himself about us, courtiers of the Almighty." His late Majesty King Nuruddin Jahangir believed in him and used to hold him in great regard. Abdul Rahim Khan Khana used to offer sijda or salutation by prostration to him. The author of this work, that is the author of the Dabistani Mazahib, in the year 1623-24, at the time when his friend and kinsmen were coming from Patna to the capital city of Akbarabad, he being a child then was carried in his lap to Chitrarupa by Mobid Hoshiar, of whose good qualities something has been said above. Chitrupa was highly pleased and uttered a prayer for the author's welfare. He made me memorize the mantra Suraj, that is the sun prayer. Thereafter, he told Ganesham, one of his disciples, who was present that day, that he should remain with me till I reach the age of maturity. Till I reach the age of discrimination, Ganesham kept me company. Ganesham, the disciple of Chitrupa, held his breath frequently. Mobed Hushiyar says that once he saw him sitting cross-legged, holding his breath till his stomach became full of air extending beyond his knees. Gosai Chitrupa died in 1637-38 at Banaras. It would be seen that our author begins by classifying Shankaracharya and Chitrupa among two different groups of yogis and does not explicitly say that Chitrupa too was a Vedantist. Though his reported description of himself as one of the courtiers of the Almighty suggests belief in monotheism, if not pantheism. While this gap remained too tantalizes, there is no doubt that the Dabistan gives us a biographical framework in which we can now fit other details about him from other sources. Chitrupa should have been born in 1559 since Jahangir describes him as of 60 years of age when he met him for the second time in the 13th year of his reign, that is 1618. By that time, he had already led 32 years of his life as a sannyasi, renouncing the world and leaving his wife, children, and parents at the age of 22. As we have seen, the Dabistan gives the further details that he was a Nagar Brahman of Gujarat and his father was a jeweler of substance and status. By the turn of the 17th century, he had gained reputation and fame enough to attract the attention of Emperor Akbar, who visited him at Ujjain on his way back from the Dakhin in 1601. Akbar's meeting with Chitrupa was indeed important enough to receive the attention of the Mughal painters. We fortunately have an extant miniature of the scene Akbar meeting Chitrupa. Let me show that to you. This is quite blurred but can still be seen while one can see.
Yes, I just lift a little upwards. Yes. Yeah,
This
yeah.
is the upper side, and the below is shown the all the nobles and others, those who were accompanying Akbar, waiting below. He's near that. Jahangir says he was keen to meet Chitrupa, but did not send for him out of regard for him. He found the first occasion to meet him at Ujjain, traversing some distance on foot in the 11th year of his reign, that is in 1617. He has described the event at some length. He gives in detail the measurements of Chitrupa's narrow abode, the strange manner in which he used to squeeze his body to get in and come out of it, his daily routine, and the meager diet that he used to take in the form of alms from certain households of the Brahmins. Jahangir met him twice in his 13th regnal year. During the first visit, the emperor went to see him at Kalyada near Ujjain. It was perhaps in the second meeting that Jahangir learned from Chitrupa the details of his early life. By 1620, Chitrupa had moved from Ujjain to Mathura, where Jahangir met him again twice in the same year and, in his own word, gained much from his company. He felt heavy at heart when parting from him. Jahangir had so much regard for Chitrupa that he was at his suggestions that emperor maintained the weight of 36 dams instead of 30, as he himself records in the Tuzuk. This influence was of much greater consequence in respect of Jahangir's relations with his son Khusrau, who had rebelled against his father and had been in prison since 1606. According to Motamad Khan, a reliable source, Mirza Aziz Koka, uh, the father-in-law of Khusrau and a very high noble under both Akbar and Jahangir, went to request Chitrupa at Mathura to help in securing the release of Prince. Chitrupa agreed and asked Jahangir to pardon Khusrau, and Jahangir thereupon ordered the latter's release. Jahangir himself makes no specific reference of any conversation with Chitrupa with regard to Khusrau, but it is significant that he mentions the decision to release Khusrau almost immediately after the description of his meeting with Chitrupa. at Mathura. Jahangir's attachment to Chitrupa is shown by a report of what occurred when the latter was persecuted by the local Jagirdar of Mathura, a brother-in-law of Jahangir's celebrated queen, Noor Jahan. The Zakhiratul Khawanin says that Chitrupa was ordered to be given lashes by Hakim Beg, the son-in-law of Etimaduddaulah, Noor Jahan's father. Jahangir took such a serious view of the incident that he dismissed Hakim Beg forthwith. The Masrul Amara adding further says that Hakim Beg was never taken in imperial service ever again. Chitrupa also made a deep impression on the people other than the emperor. According to the Dabistan, Abdur Rahim Khana used to offer him sijda. Mutamid Khan wrote a full Masnavi in his praise, referring to his small hovel, meager diet, and freedom from the world and from its ambitions and cares. Sufis used to visit Chitrupa, as is evident from the account of the Dabistan. He too was Catholic in his attitude, as is shown by the friendship he had with an Iranian Sufi and the solicitude he showed for the young Parsi author of the Dabistan. Since he saw the author as a child when he was being taken from Patna to Agra, the place of the meeting is likely to have been Banaras. If so, this means that Chitrupa had shifted to Banaras by 1623-24. Chitrupa's assignment of a disciple Ganesham to serve the author of the Dabistani Mazahib shows probably that he was favorably impressed by what he had heard of the Yazdani or Sipasi sect to which the author's family belonged, or which was deeply influenced by the Ishraqi philosophy of Shahabuddin's Maktul. Chitrupa seems to have stayed from then on at Banaras. We owe the date of his death entirely to the Dabistan. He must then have been about 80 years old. Chitrupa attracted the attention of Mughal painters. His meeting with Jahangir in his whole life hovel are the theme of few paintings of which I have already shown you. There are also portraits of him alone. Kumaraswamy was given in 1911 a portrait of his made in 1617 at Ujjain. One is grateful to the great art historian for appreciating its importance and publishing it. It is another matter that he misread its inscription so as to read the name of the painter Govardhan, a famous painter of Jahangir's court, as Kanvardhan Sinha. Sinha is again a misreading of Shabih, like likeness, while it says that the work of Govardhan Shabih hai Chitrupa, he reads it as read it totally wrongly as Sinha. This is perhaps all that one can collect about Chitrupa from our sources. One would certainly like to know more, especially about Chitrupa's own relationship to the school of Shankaracharya. But there is no doubt, if there was one man who brought the Vedanta and its pantheistic form for the first time to the notice of the Mughal court, it must surely have been Chitrupa. This too perhaps explains at least partly the extraordinary repute he came to enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Musfi. I know that you are not feeling well. You are feeling dizziness, and please have a glass of water. In the meanwhile,
That keeps going on, so don't bother.
we will put up only few questions to you, ma'am. So can we have the first question,
Most
please?
welcome. If younger ones have any curiosity and I can satisfy them, I'll be more than happy to do that.
Right. Can we have the questions, please? Sudhir Ernesto. The tenets of Hindu and Muslim mystics were similar enough that the ground was ripe for syncretic movements involving adherents of both religions. That is what you said. So he wants you to
Yes.
elaborate.
Uh,
I think
Wants me to elaborate.
elaborate on
Yes.
this statement
You
of
know,
yours.
yes. What I was trying to drive to some extent is that pantheism was present in Islamic thought as well as in Hindu thought. And this pantheism with different names were accepted and was practiced by both. Uh, you may have a pantheism of Ibn Arabi, as uh, Jahangir said, the uh, pantheism of the people of Islam. And if you will say it was Vedanta, you may say it is the pantheism of the Hindu philosophy or Hindu thought. But in both the pantheism, the idea that there is no difference between creation and creator, and thus there is no difference among creation themselves, was so very strong that became the major, what will say, the source of, what will say, or even not the source, but was somehow very akin to what was the philosophy of the Mughal Empire from Akbar onward, at least up till Jahangir, and to say some extent even up to Shah Jahan. And that was that of Sulh-e-Kul. So that is the importance of Vedanta, the similarities between Vedanta, the pantheism in Vedanta, and the Vedanta and the pantheism of the Sufistic thought or the Ibn Arabi, which shows that how the two oceans were meeting together and how both the religions in their entirety have the ideas of coexistence or total tolerance of the views of the others, because pantheism means tolerance of the all ideas.
Right, ma'am. There is another question by Mirza Hasnan. Uh, uh, Madam, did Orthodox Hindus also criticize Dara Shikoh for intermingling Islam and Hinduism? If yes, then if Dara Shikoh would have become emperor, then don't you think that his works would have been considered heretical by the Orthodox Hindus, just like no Orthodox Hindu considered Allah Upanishad as the core scripture of Hinduism?
You know, the question is that there may be exceptions and there may be some people who might have been opposing Darashiko, and it was a fact not only the Muslims but it was also the main those who really came to translate the to help him in translation of all the religious works into Sanskrit were coming from Banaras. The translation from Sanskrit into Persian could not be helped or could not be done without the support of those who were the not only the believers of the religion but really the experts of the religion. So you may remember some Hindus who might have or who were opposing him, and of course he was opposed by both. So the fanatics always remained there, but it remains a fanatic fringe. It was not the uh, learned, those who themselves were religious. We may not forget another very interesting fact, that the major translator of Sanskrit work, Sanskrit religious works in Sanskrit, in Persian was none other than Badayuni. Perforce he has to do that. But he was doing it, and he was never allowed. Whenever he tried to have any um, to make any interpolation to bring something different, Akbar was careful enough to immediately get him chastised, to find that out and to get him chastised. So to say that there were all the Hindus or all the Muslims were ready for interaction, one cannot say. But of course, there were majority who did that. The majority on both the sides were normal human beings for whom religion was religion, and they were more. Otherwise, Akbar wouldn't have become so popular. And of course, whatever Aurangzeb might have done, the policy of tolerance one finds even continuing up till Bahadur Shah Zafar. So don't forget that. What lasted and what didn't. The Mughal Empire might have been destroyed by Aurangzeb's policies, that is a different thing, or his fanaticism, that is a different thing. But the work of Akbar, the work of people like mm, what whom we were discussing, the Vedantists and those who were believers in pantheism, that lasted longer and perhaps still lasting.
Well,
So
yes, ma'am.
yes,
I would add to what Professor Musfi just pointed out. I mean, naturally, I won't go into the ideological aspect of that, but please don't forget that in the war between Dara and Aurangzeb, I mean, the question which is today being asked by many, what would have happened had Dara become the king? And in certain circles, it appears that Dara might have proven to be a very secular, better king than what Aurangzeb actually became. But I would like to humbly submit that the works of Professor M. Athar Ali and others show very clearly that during the contemporaries of Aurangzeb and Dara, the support to Dara and Aurangzeb was divided equally as far as religions were concerned. In spite of the fact that Dara had translated, Hindu texts and so on and so forth, but a large number of Rajput nobility was in fact supporting Aurangzeb and not Dara Shikoh.
may I give the reason for
Right,
that? My
right,
own explanation
mm,
for that. You
right.
know, nobility was least concerned with anything else. Anybody would
Exactly.
like to have an emperor who can expand the territory further so that they can get higher mansabs, more jagirs, more of their relations can get employment. So whether one is a Rajput or a Sayyad of Baraha or whatever, your main reason for supporting an emperor is that you are supporting emperor, you are not supporting ideologies, you are
Exactly.
supporting for a materialistic reason. And therefore nobody would have gone for an emperor, to choose an emperor who is more interested in philosophical things rather than building the empire further and entering into the Deccan and taking over the regions which were even Akbar was unable to take. So whom will you are going to support? Who is going to uh,
Exactly.
so that is the main reason. So support, you are not talking of support from the normal or the scholars or the people or the intellectuals. You are talking of the support from the what we may call within quote politicians.
Right, right, exactly. I mean, that is what I wanted to say, that, religion per se had not such a great role to play in who would become the king, who would not become the king. I would also remind the audience that there exists a letter which Aurangzeb's son, Prince Akbar, wrote to Aurangzeb, in which there is a sentence. It's a very remarkable sentence which today we should remember, that have you forgotten that you came to the throne because the Rajputs supported you, as against what they did to your brother Dara Shikoh. So, I mean, these are the things. And as Professor Muswi said, that they were more concerned about the political aspects and their own these things, administration and so on and
Ambitions
so
and
forth,
ambitions.
ambitions. Remember, Dara, when he had been sent on a campaign to Kandahar, what did he
Totally.
do? I mean, he was playing games. I mean, just before the battle was being fought, he had a full drama played where horses and horsemen were fighting against each other. His army was divided into two sections. One represented the Iranians, the other the Mughal soldiers, and then the party which had were representing the Mughals. They won the battle, and then celebrations were held. And then on the actual battle day, he lost it. So, I mean, who would have wanted such a person in spite of the intellectual, prowess which he had? So these are a number of questions which go. It is not very simple that had he become the king, what would have happened? This is just a question which I think is very apparent what would have happened had he become the king of India. Zainab Naqvi asks, thanks for the lecture, ma'am. Do we have the details of the religious discourses of Jadrub available in the Tuzuk or in any other source, or are there just references to the Vedantic principles the two discussed?
I didn't get the full question.
Thanks for the lecture. Do we have the details of the religious discourses of Jadrub available in the Tuzuk or in any other sources, or are there just references in the Vedantic principles the two discussed?
No, no. No, I have already said that what I am citing from is most of it is from the Tuzuk itself.
Hmm.
So it is not that it is not available anywhere else. It is in the Tuzuk that we get a large number of his discourses, and then there are other sources as well. But these discourses on pantheism, of course, is a very big section there in Tuzuk itself.
Right. There was yet another question. Ali Kazim. Adab ma'am, did Jahangir share his experience of interaction with Jadrub Gosain during the sessions of Majalis-e Jahangiri?
It's not in the Majalis-e Jahangiri, it's only in the Tuzuk-e Jahangiri. At least the copy of the Majalis-e Jahangiri I have doesn't talk of him. That's a totally different sort of it. Information available there on which he has worked, as well as I have written 2 papers. But this is in Tuzuk itself he talks, as I have already mentioned.
Right, ma'am. The next question, please. There is a question by Ali Haider. Why Mughals are not given respect for doing so much for the patronage of Hindu scriptures with such illuminated miniatures of Mughal imperial artists like is given by Maharaja Ranjit Singh or other non-Hindu rulers of Indian government?
I don't know, respect by whom? That is the question. So, if you will say respect by historians or respect by the normal human beings or those who are concerned, that's a different thing. If you are talking about, as far as the common people are concerned, they are least aware who did what and who preserved what. So, that question is rather not very to the point.
Sudhir Ernesto had repeatedly asked a question. The Advait doctrine of Shankara cut at the very root of Bhaktivad. Do you agree?
Bhaktivad.
Yeah.
Seems.
Before Professor Musfi answers this question, I would just say to Sudhir Ernesto that this question should be asked to a person who is making a presentation on Advaitism or on Shankar. Here, what is being dealt
Shankaracharya.
is Shankaracharya. Here, what is being dealt with is how he was perceived by the Mughals. So, I think if you have a question on that, that would be more pertinent. However, I will leave Professor Muswi to take her decision whether she wants to ask this question.
The question, while we are talking of bhakti, the question is what bhakti you are talking of, Nirgun or Sagun? That is the first question. Anyone who is a Nirgun Bhakti, who have Nirgun Bhakti, certainly will be fully with whatever the pantheism is about, and there is no two questions. But if you go to Sagun Bhakti, then you do not expect this sort of a philosophical thing. The minute I need an image before me, the philosophy goes, and my own level is of a different. If I need for having my concentration something like a human figure or something, then we can I cannot just conceive, or no one can conceive of a pantheistic word and those ideas which are present over there.
I would request Sudhir Ernesto to consult an edited work by Professor J.S. Grewal. There
Yes.
he has dealt with this question. Uh, I am no historian of philosophy or of Advaitism, but for the general public, because this question has been asked, Shankar's philosophy was in fact trying to negate the influence of Buddhism in Indian culture. Whereas whatever influence Shankaracharya had through his philosophy of Maya, which he built up, which greatly affected the Bhakti movement. In fact, one can say that the Bhakti movement started developing after Shankara's philosophy of Maya
Of
and
course.
what. But then Ramananda came, and Ramananda tried to negate what Shankaracharya had talked about. But for a more lucid discussion on this topic, this is not the occasion. And but if you really want to read about from the historical
Yes.
perspective, not
Garewal's
the
absolutely
religious
correct.
perspective, then please consult the book of J.S. Grewal. Another question: is there any other question? Uh, the emergence of early capitalism in the Mughal period was primarily due to urbanization and commercialization. Comment.
Righto, from the word of philosophy, we came to the materialistic word. But this is a question which can be more.
Again, I will just stop Professor Musfi from answering, and I'll just once again ask Sudhir Ernesto that in this series, which he has possibly joined for the first time, this is the 50th lecture. There are 49 more, and this problem issue has been discussed by Professor Irfan Habib and some others. If you are not reading some other book, then please go through those lectures. You will get an answer. Professor Musfi.
I think it was this question in a different form
Yeah,
was
yeah,
put
you
to me as
also
well when I
right.
was discussing
Yes,
economy.
yes, by you also.
Question of
Yeah,
capitalism. Yes.
yeah, yeah. Sudhir Ernesto has also the question: the tenets of Hindu and Muslim mystics were similar enough that the ground was ripe for syncretic movement. That has been put up, Shagufta. That has been put up. That Professor Musfi has already answered. Uh, so I think there is a question by Hasnain Aziz. Do we find presence of Vedanta in Mughal poetry, just like Sufism is present in Mughal poetry?
Then the question is that what you call Vedanta and what you call Sufism. If you are talking of simply mysticism, and you find mysticism, it will depend upon you whether you consider its source from Vedanta or from from Ibn Arabi or from Shankaracharya, because both have the same pantheism.
I
And
would
if
just,
pantheism
yeah.
is present, it's very difficult to say. You can't just have, you say, we have now become so uh, used to putting a religious stamp on everything that while there are, if you'll say that both think very reasonably or logically, you will say whether this logic is Islamic or Hinduist. So the logic is logic.
Uh,
It cannot be Hindu logic, it cannot be Muslim logic. So if you will say pantheism is pantheism.
Hassan Aziz Saab, I'll just put it in a different way. Take one of the Quranic verses which we Muslims keep on, repeating again and again whenever somebody dies. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi rajaun. From God we come, to God we return. Would you call it as a Upanishadic philosophy or a Quranic philosophy or what? I mean, this is exactly what Shankaracharya had also tried to, in his philosophy of Maya. That was the philosophy which is reflected, which is the same. I'm not citing any Sufi saint or anybody. I'm just citing from the Quran. I mean, the thing is that in both the traditions, the mystical ideas are developing in the same fashion. So, as Professor Musfi rightly pointed out, that when those pantheistic verses which are there in a large amount as far as the Mughal period poetry is concerned, uh, whom would you identify it with? Whether with the Indian philosophy of pantheism or with Wahdatul Wujud? Because except for the change of the language, Arabic or Sanskrit, the ideas almost remain the same. So, I mean, it all depends how you want to look at it. I think, Professor Musfi, we have taken enough of your time.
Thank
There's
you.
another question by Sudhir Ernesto. I'm so thankful to him that
Yes,
he's keeping us engaged. Was Sulekul inspired by Wahdatul Wujud of Ibn al-Arabi?
certainly.
Yes.
I'll say certainly, no doubt about it. And then you may not only say that it was only from Ibn Arabi, if the sources were from, of course, Ibn Arabi was came to the knowledge of Akbar and others much earlier than Shankaracharya. So you may say that he was the first influence, but of course there must be a further impetus given to these sort of ideas once they are not confined from one source but from more than one source. Sources from both is the mingling of the two oceans, as uh, Darashikoh tried to put.
Right. Sudhir, I would once again suggest a few books to you. There is a book edited by Professor Irfan Habib, Religion in Medieval India, in which you have an article by Professor Musfi on Sulekul. So that is one of the latest ones. So you can start with that and go back to a book which is very important as far as understanding Sulekul is concerned. That is by Professor Sayyid Athar Abbas Rizvi. Intellectual movements during the reign of Akbar, where he has tried to not only deal with the Ibadat Khana debates but also gone into the details of the idea of Sulekul. And of course, there are many, many other works through which
Professor
that
Athar Ali's work,
Atharali's
his
work, I mean,
art-
a series of
collection of
articles,
articles.
collections of articles which he has written on this topic. In fact, a large number of very good scholars have taken up pen on this topic, including Professor Nurul Hassan, and Irfan Habib's introduction to that edited work is an excellent account of what Sulekul is. Professor Satish Chandra Satish Chandra's wife, what was her name? She was also there. She has also written a very good article in one of the edited works of Professor Irfan Habib, published by Irfan Habib, where Mrs. Satish Chandra has written an article on Sulekul. So there is much material available which one may be able to read. Muhammad Mohiuddin says that it is nice to see you both after long. Really, it is a good session. I mean, Mohiuddin Saab, keep on coming, and every Friday and Sunday you will keep on meeting us again and again. We have been there since the last 7 months. Professor Musfi has also been there for a number of times. Ma'am, can you throw some light on Wahdatul Wujud and Wahdatul Shuhud?
I think now my throat is now paining a
Well,
lot.
I will, on behalf of
So,
Professor Musfi, I
so
will take up
you
your
better
question.
do it.
I'll just
Yes.
take up in a very light way. I mean, I won't give a
Yes.
very academic answer to that. Wahdatul Wujud is, as has been explained in the Upanishads, that you take a pinch of salt and mix it in a glass of water. What happens is that once you mix both the things together and you start looking up for the salt, you can only taste it, you can never see it. So Wahdatul Wujud, in fact, is something like that. Or take a drop of water which falls into the river, and a question is asked, where is the drop of the water? Is it there? Yes, it is there. But you cannot single it out because now it's a part of the river. And once the river falls into the ocean, where is the river water gone? Can you separate it? You cannot separate it, but it is a part of the ocean. So that concept is Wahdatul Wujud. Wahdatul Shuhud is a little different. Wahdatul Shuhud means you and your shadow. When you stand under the sun, your shadow falls near you. So if I touch your shadow, am I touching you? No, because the shadow is not you. But can the shadow exist without you? No, it cannot exist without you. That is वहदतुल शुहूद, जिसका आप मुशाहिदा कर सकें. That is the existence which you can perceive indirectly. So there were certain mystics who believed in the theory of Wahdatul Wujud, Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi rajaun. From God we come and into God we mix. And there were other Sufis who believed that no, I and you can never be God. We are like a shadow of God. We are different, we are dark, we are negative, but after all, we come out of God, and when God is not there, then the ourself, the shadow which represents us, is also not there. That is a short, simple, precise answer which was given to me around Professor Musfi's around 30 years back or so, or 40 years back, when we were attending the classes of Professor Khaliq Ahmad Nizami on Sufism. This is the answer. This is what he tried to explain to us, the difference between Wahdatul Wujud and Shuhud. I possibly, like me, you will also not forget the difference between the two after listening to these examples. Professor Musfi, I have taken an issue of your time, and I know that you are not well. In spite of that, you gave us more than 1 hour. I started with the fact saying that this was our 50th lecture. I am really thankful to you and proud of the fact that my teacher was there to give the 50th lecture
Thank
of
you
this
very much
series.
for your
Uh, uh,
and
I, I would really thank once again all the participants. Today also the number was live viewership was more than 30, which kept on varying from time to time. But a lot of people were hearing it, your lecture, and once it is gone on the YouTube or Facebook, more and more people would be seeing it. I really thank all of you that constantly from day one, when we started 7 months back till date, All of you have been, supporting us, giving us the strength. Without you, we would not have been able to hold on for such a long time. Possibly, we would be continuing for a few more weeks, and please make it a point to keep on attending in the future also. In the last, I would just say, although for the time being, the time of the lectures would remain the same, 8 o'clock. I think that that would be enough. But there is also the fact that within a few days, the month of fasting is starting, Ramadan. So I don't know. I'm not such a religious man to know the exact timings of the iftar. But if in case there is some clash with that, then we may delay it a bit. And if the time is not clashing with that, then we will continue with 8 o'clock time as usual. And we look forward that there are many other scholars from outside India and some from within India who would be coming and speaking to us on many interesting topics. Thank you once again, Professor Muswi, and thank you all for joining us this evening. Good night.